Last year we had a situation where, for example, multi-factor authentication in Azure Active Directory failed, and basically anyone who had MFA enabled couldn't access Azure resources. That was a big issue, especially for the administrators, because at that certain point, most of the people that were in charge of administrating resources couldn't access Azure. Now, one of the security recommendations that Microsoft has is to have a break glass account that is basically an admin account in Azure Active Directory that doesn't have MFA enabled. And the point of this account is to be used only in certain situations. For example, when MFA is down, you can go and temporarily disable MFA for certain users, etc. Even it gives you a backdoor for this specific case. A lot of people are really concerned with a recommendation like that. Do we really want to have global admin account that has kind of access to everything, even with MFA disabled? It's a kind of question that we need to decide for ourselves. Does this fits our security policies? Are we comfortable with that risk? Are we more comfortable with risk having that account or losing access to Azure for a couple of hours or something? It's kind of a lot of these recommendations are good guidelines, but we need to decide for ourselves if we're going to implement it or not. Some other things that we have, for example, are regulatory compliance recommendations. So if we are using some of the standards in security, for example, ISO 27001 or SOC or whatever, there are multiple options. So let's go to the ISO 27001, for example, that's mostly popular in Europe. We have a lot of recommendations in here that will help us. So we have guidelines what needs to be set in our Azure environment and how security settings needs to be laid out in order to actually satisfy the requirements of ISO 27001. So basically, if we follow those guidelines and implement everything here that Azure Security Center recommends us, we would be able to pass the ISO 27001, at least from the perspective of the cloud. We still need to probably figure a lot of things that how they are handled in our local offices, etc., how we do things with some procedures. But from the Azure perspective, this would suffice to actually pass that kind of certification. Same goes to other like SOC or PCI that are mostly used in the United States, for example. Besides a lot of information, we have still some other recommendations how our recommendations go, what is the severity of the threats that we have in our subscription, what we need to do, and so on. We have also separated this by the resources, different resources for the compute applications, how our networking is set up, what we need to do on that part, how our data and storage is secured, what we need to increase there, how our how security can be created better, and etc. One of the best things, my favorite things in Azure Security Center is just-in-time VM access. I already mentioned when we discussed privileged entity management that I'm a big fan of just-in-time access, and this gives us another example of that. So what just-in-time VM access does here is it's not recommended to manage the virtual machines from public IP addresses. But it's basically let's put it like that. I did a brief test. I created 5 virtual machines. I exposed the RDP port publicly, and I just left them there standing for a month. I wanted to see what is going to happen, and I enabled threat detection, and I was like looking in the Azure Security Center of what's going on with those virtual machines. So in a single month time, I had 30,000 hits on each of those virtual machines. 30,000 brute force attempts happened on each of those virtual machines in a single month. So by just exposing those virtual machines, and these were not like targeted virtual machines, these were like freshly created, nothing on them, nothing special about them, and left vulnerable. So 30,000 brute force attack on each of those virtual machines in a single month. This is like a number I have. This is my personal data. This is my personal test that I created. I can vouch for validity of that information. So in the terms, what happens once we open the public IP address and say, okay, let's open RDP port on this public IP address, let's access it, it will be hit from multiple directions. Basically, bad guys scan the IP ranges, and once they notice that we have IP address with RDP port open, they're going to hit it like hell. They're going to try to brute force that virtual machine. It's bad practice to disable that kind of access and to either access virtual machines from the point to site or site to site connections, so basically from the secure environments, from the secure networks. But in some cases it's not an option. In some cases you're not able to provide those sort of accesses, and you need to have public IP address access to certain virtual machines. In that case, just-in-time access helps us increase the security of those virtual machines that are kind of left vulnerable. What happens? So if I go to VM access and I say, okay, let's see the recommended, I can see that my virtual machine here is recommended to be enabled. So what it says, it detects, Azure Security Center detects all the virtual machines in your subscription that have public IP access enabled. So if I go to these virtual machines and I say, just one sec, enable JIT. So what this happened is it will offer me to say on which ports. So if I go to this port, say like, hey, I want this one, or I want to delete this one, or I want to delete this one, or I want to enable and all, and say save, this will enable just-in-time access to those specific ports. But how it actually works. So let's switch to configured one. So let's say I'm here and I want to enable access on this one. I wouldn't be able to access this virtual machine by default. I need to go to the Azure portal, go to that virtual machine and request access. So what happens here, this will enable RDP access to that virtual machine. I can say, is it going to be from this specific IP address, the IP address that I'm coming from, or if it's going to be from the IP ranges, if I know certain IP addresses that I'm coming from. And I can also determine the amount of time that I'm going to enable. So if I go to say, okay, let's see, 1 hour, and I say I will open this port, so 3389 is on from my IP address for 1 hour and open. Now I can access my virtual machine from my IP address for 1 hour using RDP port. Once that hour expires, I will no longer be able to connect, and I would need to go to the portal and request the access again. So this way I'm controlling the process, and I'm controlling when and from where I'm going to connect to that virtual machine. So even if it's exposed to RDP access, that RDP access is restricted to the controlled conditions that I have kind of control in.